Welcome, dreamer. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey into rest, I want to take just a moment to thank you for being here. If you enjoy these calming sleep stories and they help bring peace to your nights, please consider supporting the channel by liking this video, subscribing, or sharing it with someone you care about. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing for all who need it. Now, let's settle in. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. Let the day begin to melt away. You're safe here. You're held. And you don't have to do anything except relax. Tonight, we'll drift into a world where starlight dances across a quiet lake, where the air is cool and clean, and the only sound is the soft ripple of water beneath your boat. With every breath, we'll go deeper into stillness, gently floating, gently dreaming. Let's begin tonight's bedtime stories. A mandarin once lived in Qiangho who was so exceedingly cross and disagreeable that everyone hated him. He snarled and stormed at every person he met and was never known to laugh or be merry under any circumstances. Especially he hated boys and girls, for the boys jeered at him, which aroused his wrath, and the girls made fun of him, which hurt his pride. When he had become so unpopular that no one would speak to him, the emperor heard about it and commanded him to emigrate to America. This suited the Mandarin very well, but before he left China, he stole the great book of magic that belonged to the wise magician Hao Tsai. Then, gathering up his little store of money, he took ship for America. He settled in a city of the Middle West and of course started a laundry, since that seems to be the natural vocation of every Chinaman, be he coolie or Mandarin. He made no acquaintances with the other Chinamen of the town, who, when they met him and saw the red button in his hat, knew him for a real Mandarin and bowed low before him. He put up a red and white sign, and people brought their laundry to him and got paper checks with Chinese characters upon them. In exchange, this being the only sort of character the Mandarin had left. One day, as the ugly one was ironing in his shop in the basement of 263.5 Main Street, he looked up and saw a crowd of childish faces pressed against the window. Most Chinamen make friends with children. This one hated them and tried to drive them away. But as soon as he returned to his work, they were back at the window again, mischievously smiling down upon him. The naughty Mandarin uttered horrid words in the Manchu language and made fierce gestures, but this did no good at all. The children stayed as long as they pleased, and they came again the very next day as soon as school was over, and likewise the next day and the next, for they saw their presence at the window bothered the Chinamen, and were delighted accordingly. The following day being Sunday, the children did not appear. But as the mandarin, being a heathen, worked in his little shop, a big butterfly flew in at the open door and fluttered about the room. The mandarin closed the door and chased the butterfly until he caught it, when he pinned it against the wall by sticking 2 pins through its beautiful wings. This did not hurt the butterfly, there being no feeling in its wings, but it made him a safe prisoner. This butterfly was of large size, and its wings were exquisitely marked by gorgeous colors laid out in regular designs like the stained glass windows of a cathedral. The mandarin now opened his wooden chest and drew forth the great book of magic he had stolen from Houtsai. Turning the pages slowly, he came to a passage describing how to understand the language of butterflies. This he read carefully, and then mixed a magic formula in a tin cup and drank it down with a wry face. Immediately thereafter he spoke to the butterfly in its own language, saying, "Why did you enter this room?" "I smelled beeswax," answered the butterfly. "Therefore I thought I might find honey here." "But you are my prisoner," said the mandarin. "If I please, I can kill you, or leave you on the wall to starve to death." "I expect that," replied the butterfly with a sigh. "But my race is short-lived anyway. It doesn't matter whether death comes sooner or later. Yet you like to live, do you not?" asked the mandarin. "Yet life is pleasant and the world is beautiful. I do not seek death." "Then," said the mandarin, "I will give you life, a long and pleasant life, if you will promise to obey me for a time and carry out my instructions." "How can a butterfly serve a man?" asked the creature in surprise. "Usually they cannot," was the reply. "But I have a book of magic which teaches me strange things. Do you promise?" "Oh, yes, I promise," answered the butterfly, "for even as your slave I will get some enjoyment out of life, while should you kill me, that is the end of everything." "Truly," said the mandarin, "butterflies have no souls, and therefore cannot live again." "But I have enjoyed 3 lives already," returned the butterfly with some pride. "I have been a caterpillar and a chrysalis before I became a butterfly. You were never anything but a Chinaman, although I admit your life is longer than mine." "I will extend your life for many days if you will obey me," declared the Chinaman. "I can easily do so by means of my magic." "Of course I will obey you," said the butterfly carelessly. "Then listen, you know children, do you not? Boys and girls?" "Yes, I know them. They chase me and try to catch me as you have done," replied the butterfly. "And they mock me and jeer at me through the window," continued the mandarin bitterly. "Therefore they are your enemies and mine. But with your aid and the help of the magic book we shall have a fine revenge for their insults." "I don't care much for revenge," said the butterfly. "They are but children, and 'tis natural they should wish to catch such a beautiful creature as I am. Nevertheless, I care, and you must obey me," retorted the mandarin harshly. "I, at least, will have my revenge." Then he stuck a drop of molasses upon the wall beside the butterfly's head and said, "Eat that, while I read my book and prepare my magic formula." So the butterfly feasted upon the molasses, and the mandarin studied his book, after which he began to mix a magic compound in the tin cup. When the mixture was ready, he released the butterfly from the wall and said to it, "I command you to dip your 2 front feet into this magic compound, and then fly away until you meet a child. Fly close, whether it be a boy or a girl, and touch the child upon its forehead with your feet. Whosoever is thus touched, the book declares, will at once become a pig, and will remain such forever after. Then return to me and dip your legs afresh in the contents of this cup. So shall all my enemies, the children, become miserable swine, while no one will think of accusing me of the sorcery." "Very well. Since such is your command, I obey," said the butterfly. Then it dipped its front legs, which were the shortest of the 6, into the contents of the tin cup, and flew out of the door and away over the houses to the edge of the town. There it alighted in a flower garden, and soon forgot all about its mission to turn children into swine. In going from flower to flower, it soon brushed the magic compound from its legs, so that when the sun began to set and the butterfly finally remembered its master, the mandarin, it could not have injured a child had it tried, but it did not intend to try. That horrid old Chinaman, it thought, hates children and wishes to destroy them. But I rather like children myself, and shall not harm them. Of course I must return to my master, for he is a magician, and would seek me out and kill me. But I can deceive him about this matter easily enough." When the butterfly flew in at the door of the mandarin's laundry, he asked eagerly, "Well, did you meet a child?" "I did," replied the butterfly calmly. "It was a pretty golden-haired girl, but now 'tis a grunting pig." "Good, good, good," cried the mandarin, dancing joyfully about the room. "You shall have molasses for your supper, and tomorrow you must change 2 children into pigs." The butterfly did not reply, but ate the molasses in silence. Having no soul, it had no conscience, and having no conscience, it was able to lie to the mandarin with great readiness and a certain amount of enjoyment. Next morning, by the mandarin's command, the butterfly dipped its legs in the mixture and flew away in search of children. When it came to the edge of the town, it noticed a pig in a sty, and alighting upon the rail of the sty, it looked down at the creature and thought, "If I could change a child into a pig by touching it with the magic compound, what could I change a pig into, I wonder?" Being curious to determine this fine point in sorcery, the butterfly fluttered down and touched its front feet to the pig's nose. Instantly the animal disappeared, and in its place was a shock-headed, dirty-looking boy, which sprang from the sty and ran down the road uttering loud whoops. "That's funny," said the butterfly to itself. "The mandarin would be very angry with me if he knew of this, for I have liberated one more of the creatures that bother him. It fluttered along after the boy, who had paused to throw stones at a cat. But Pussy escaped by running up a tree, where thick branches protected her from the stones. Then the boy discovered a newly planted garden and trampled upon the beds until the seeds were scattered far and wide and the garden was ruined. Next he caught up a switch and struck with it a young calf that stood quietly grazing in a field. The poor creature ran away with piteous bleats, and the boy laughed and followed after it, striking the frightened animal again and again. Really, thought the butterfly, I do not wonder the mandarin hates children if they are all so cruel and wicked as this one. The calf having escaped him, the boy came back to the road where he met two little girls on their way to school. One of them had a red apple in her hand, and the boy snatched it away and began eating it. The little girl commenced to cry, but her companion, more brave and sturdy, cried out, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, you nasty boy." At this, the boy reached out and slapped her pretty face, whereupon she also began to sob. Although possessed of neither soul nor conscience, the butterfly had a very tender heart, and now decided it could endure this boy no longer. If I permitted him to exist, it reflected, I should never forgive myself, for the monster would do nothing but evil from morning till night. So it flew directly into his face and touched his forehead with its sticky front feet. The next instant the boy had disappeared, but a grunting pig ran swiftly up the road in the direction of its sty. The butterfly gave a sigh of relief. This time I have indeed used the mandarin's magic upon a child, it whispered, as it floated lazily upon the light breeze. But since the child was originally a pig, I do not think I have any cause to reproach myself. The little girls were sweet and gentle, and I would not injure them to save my life. But were all boys like this transformed pig, I should not hesitate to carry out the mandarin's orders. Then it flew into a rose bush, where it remained comfortably until evening. At sundown it returned to its master. "Have you changed two of them into pigs?" he asked at once. "I have," replied the butterfly. "One was a pretty black-eyed baby, and the other a freckle-faced, red-haired, barefooted new boy." "Good, good, good," screamed the mandarin, in an ecstasy of delight. "Those are the ones who torment me the most. Change every new boy you meet into a pig." "Very well," answered the butterfly quietly, and ate its supper of molasses. Several days were passed by the butterfly in the same manner. It fluttered aimlessly about the flower gardens while the sun shone, and returned at night to the mandarin with false tales of turning children into swine. Sometimes it would be one child which was transformed, sometimes two, and occasionally three. But the mandarin always greeted the butterfly's report with intense delight and gave him molasses for supper. One evening, however, the butterfly thought it might be well to vary the report, so that the mandarin might not grow suspicious, and when its master asked what child had been changed into a pig that day, the lying creature answered. It was a Chinese boy, and when I touched him he became a black pig. This angered the mandarin, who was in an especially cross mood. He spitefully snapped the butterfly with his finger and nearly broke its beautiful wing, for he forgot that Chinese boys had once mocked him and only remembered his hatred for American boys. The butterfly became very indignant at this abuse from the mandarin. It refused to eat its molasses and sulked all the evening, for it had grown to hate the mandarin almost as much as the mandarin hated children. When morning came, it was still trembling with indignation, but the mandarin cried out, "Make haste, miserable slave, for today you must change 4 children into pigs to make up for yesterday." The butterfly did not reply. His little black eyes were sparkling wickedly, and no sooner had he dipped his feet into the magic compound than he flew full in the mandarin's face and touched him upon his ugly, flat forehead. Soon after, a gentleman came into the room for his laundry. The mandarin was not there, but running around the place was a repulsive, scrawny pig, which squealed most miserably. The butterfly flew away to a brook and washed from its feet all traces of the magic compound. When night came, it slept in a rose bush. The little old lady lived over the way, through a green gate that shut with a click, and up 3 white steps. Every morning at 8 o'clock, the church bell chimed for morning prayer. Chim, chime, chim, chime. And every morning at 8 o'clock, the little old lady came down the white steps and opened the gate with a click, and went where the bells were calling. About this time also, little Ida would kneel on a chair at her nursery window in the opposite house to watch the old lady come out and go. The old lady was one of those people who look always the same. Every morning her cheeks looked like faded rose leaves, and her white hair like a snow wreath in a garden laughing at the last tea rose. Every morning she wore the same black satin bonnet and the same white shawl, had delicate gloves on the smallest of hands, and gathered her skirt daintily up from the smallest of feet. Every morning she carried a clean pocket handkerchief and a fresh rose in the same hand with her prayer book. And as the prayer book, being bound up with the Bible, was very thick, she seemed to have some difficulty in so doing. Every morning, whatever the weather might be, she stood outside the green gate and looked up at the sky to see if this were clear, and down at the ground to see if that were dry, and so went where the bells were calling. Ida knew the little old lady quite well by sight, but she did not know her name. Perhaps Ida's great-uncle knew it, but he was a grave, unsociable man who saw very little of his neighbors, so perhaps he did not. And Ida stood too much in awe of him to trouble him with idle questions. She had once asked Nurse, but Nurse did not know. So the quiet orphan child asked no more. She made up a name for the little old lady herself, however, after the manner of Mr. John Bunyan, and called her Mrs. Over the Way, and morning after morning, though the bread and milk breakfast smoked upon the table, she would linger at the window, beseeching, "1 minute more, dear nurse. Please let me wait till Mrs. Over the Way has gone to church." And when the little old lady had come out and gone, Ida would creep from her perch and begin her breakfast. Then, if the chimes went on till half the basinful was eaten, little Ida would nod her head contentedly and whisper, "Mrs. Over the Way was in time." Little Ida's history was a sad one. Her troubles began when she was but a year old, with the greatest of earthly losses, for then her mother died, leaving a sailor husband and their infant child. The sea captain could face danger, but not an empty home. So he went back to the winds and the waves, leaving his little daughter with relations. 6 long years had he been away, and Ida had had many homes, and yet, somehow, no home, when one day the postman brought her a large letter with her own name written upon it in a large hand. This was no old envelope sealed up again, no make-believe epistle to be put into the post through the nursery door. It was a real letter with a real seal, real stamps, and a great many postmarks. And when Ida opened it, there were 2 sheets written by the captain's very own hand, in round, fat characters, easy to read, with a sketch of the captain's very own ship at the top. And most welcome above all, the news that the captain's very own self was coming home. "I shall have a papa all to myself very soon, nurse," said Ida. "He has written a letter to me and made me a picture of his ship. It is the Bonne Espérance, which he says means good hope. I love this letter better than anything he has ever sent me." Nevertheless, Ida took out the carved fans and work boxes, the beads and handkerchiefs and feathers, the dainty foreign treasures the sailor father had sent to her from time to time, dusted them, kissed them, and told them that the captain was coming home. But the letter she wore in her pocket by day and kept under her pillow by night. "Why don't you put your letter into one of your boxes like a tidy young lady, Miss Ida?" said Nurse. "You'll wear it all to bits doing as you do." "It will last till the ship comes home," said Miss Ida. It had need then to have been written on the rock, graven with an iron pen forever, for the Bonne Espérance, like other earthly hopes, had perished to return no more. She foundered on her homeward voyage, and went down into the great waters, whilst Ida slept through the stormy night, with the captain's letter beneath her pillow. Alas, alas, alas! 2 or 3 months had now passed away since Ida became an orphan. She had become accustomed to the crape-hung frock. She had learnt to read the captain's letter as the memorial of a good hope which it had pleased God to disappoint. She was fairly happy again. It was in the midst of that new desolation in her lonely life that she had come to stay with her great-uncle, and had begun to watch the doings of the little old lady who lived over the way. when dolls seemed vanity and Noah's Ark a burden. It had been a quiet amusement, demanding no exertion, to see what little she could see of the old lady's life, and to speculate about what she could not, to wonder and fancy what Mrs. Over-the-Way looked like without her bonnet, and what she did with herself when she was not at church. Ida's imagination did not carry her far. She believed her friend to be old, immeasurably old, indefinitely old, and had a secret faith that she had never been otherwise. She felt sure that she wore a cap indoors, and that it was a nicer one than nurse's, that she had real tea, with sugar and cream instead of milk and water, and hot toast rather than bread and treacle for tea, that she helped herself at meals and went to bed according to her own pleasure and convenience, was, perhaps on these very grounds, utterly happy, and had always been so. "I am only a little girl," said Ida, as she pressed her face sadly to the cold window-pane. "I am only a little girl, and very sad, you know, because Papa was drowned at sea. But Mrs. Over-the-Way is very old, and always happy, and so I love her." And in this there was both philosophy and truth. It is a mistake to suppose that the happiness of others is always a distasteful sight to the sad at heart. There are times in which life seems shorn of interests and bereaved of pleasure, when it is a relief, almost amounting to consolation, to believe that anyone is happy. It is some feeling of this nature, perhaps, which makes the young so attractive to the old. It soothes like the sound of harmonious music, the sight of harmonious beauty. It witnesses to a conviction lying deep even in the most afflicted souls that, come what may, all things were created good and man made to be blessed, before which sorrow and sighing flee away. This was one of many things which formed the attraction for Ida in the little old lady who lived over the way. That green gate shut in a life of which the child knew nothing, and which might be one of mysterious delights. To believe that such things could be was consoling, and to imagine them was real entertainment. Ida would sometimes draw a chair quietly to the table beside her own, and fancy that Mrs. Over-the-Way was having tea with her. She would ask the old lady if she had been in time for church that morning, beg her to take off her bonnet, and apologize politely for the want of hot tea and toast. So far all was well, for Ida could answer any of these remarks on Mrs. Over-the-Way's behalf. But it may be believed that after a certain point this one-sided conversation flagged. One day Nurse overheard Ida's low murmurs. "What are you talking about, Miss Ida?" said she. "I am pretending to have Mrs. Over-the-Way to tea," said Ida. "Little girls shouldn't pretend what's not true," replied Nurse, in whose philosophy fancy and falsehood were not distinguished. "Play with your dolls, my dear, and don't move the chairs out of their places." With which Nurse carried off the chair into a corner as if it had been a naughty child, and Ida gave up her daydream with a sigh, since to have prolonged the fancy that Mrs. Over-the-Way was present She must have imagined her borne off at the crisis of the meal after a fashion not altogether consistent with an old lady's dignity. Summer passed, and winter came on. There were days when the white steps looked whiter than usual, when the snowdrift came halfway up the little green gate, and the snowflakes came softly down with a persistency which threatened to bury the whole town. Ida knew that on such days Mrs. Over-the-Way could not go out. But whenever it was tolerably fine, the old lady appeared as usual, came daintily down the steps, and went where the bells were calling. Chim, chime, chim, chime. They sounded so near through the frosty air that Ida could almost have fancied that the church was coming round through the snowy streets to pick up the congregation. Mrs. Over-the-Way looked much the same in winter as in summer. She seemed as fresh and lively as ever, carried her prayer book and handkerchief in the same hand, was only more warmly wrapped up, and wore fur-lined boots, which were charming. There was one change, however, which went to Ida's heart. The little old lady had no longer a flower to take to church with her. At Christmas she took a sprig of holly, and after that a spray of myrtle, but Ida felt that these were poor substitutes for a rose. She knew that Mrs. Over-the-Way had flowers somewhere, it is true, for certain pots of forced hyacinths had passed through the little green gate to the Christmas church decorations. But one's winter garden is too precious to be cropped as recklessly as summer rose bushes, and the old lady went flowerless to church and enjoyed her bulbs at home. But the change went to Ida's heart. Spring was early that year. At the beginning of February there was a good deal of snow on the ground, it is true, but the air became milder and milder, and towards the end of the month there came a real spring day, and all the snow was gone. "You may go and play in the garden, Miss Ida," said Nurse, and Ida went. She had been kept indoors for a long time by the weather and by a cold, and it was very pleasant to get out again, even when the only amusement was to run up and down the shingly walks and wonder how soon she might begin to garden, and whether the gardener could be induced to give her a piece of ground sufficiently extensive to grow a crop of mustard and cress in the form of a capital one. It was the kitchen garden into which Ida had been sent. At the far end it was cut off from the world by an overgrown hedge with large gaps at the bottom, through which Ida could see the high road, a trough for watering horses, and beyond this, a wood. The hedge was very thin in February, and Ida had a good view in consequence, and sitting on a stump in the sunshine, she peered through the gap to see if any horses came to drink. It was as good as a peep show, and indeed much better. "The snow has melted," gurgled the water. "Here I am." It was everywhere. The sunshine made the rich green mosses look dry, but in reality they were wet, and so was everything else. Slish, slosh. Put your feet where you would, the water was everywhere. It filled the stone trough, which, being old and gray and steady, kept it still, and bade it reflect the blue sky and the gorgeous mosses. but the trough soon overflowed, and then the water slipped over the side and ran off in a wayside stream. Winter is gone, it spluttered as it ran. Winter is gone, winter is gone, winter is gone. And on the principle that a good thing cannot be said too often, it went on with this all through the summer, till the next winter came and stopped its mouth with icicles. As the stream chattered, so the birds in the woods sang, tweet, tweet, chirrup, throstle, spring, spring, spring. And they twittered from tree to tree and shook the bare twigs with melody, whilst a single blackbird sitting still upon a bough below sang, life, 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 with the loudest pipe of his throat, because on such a day it was happiness only to be alive. It was like a wonderful fairy tale, to which Ida listened with clasped hands. Presently another song came from the wood. It was a hymn sung by children's voices, such as one often hears caroled by a troop of little urchins coming home from school. The words fell familiarly on Ida's ears. Quite through the streets with silver sound, the flood of life doth flow, upon whose banks on every side the wood of life doth grow. Thy gardens and thy gallant walks continually are green. There grow such sweet and pleasant flowers as nowhere else are seen. Their trees for evermore bear fruit, and evermore do spring. There evermore the angels sit, and evermore do sing. Here the little chorus broke off, and the children came pouring out of the wood with chattering and laughter. Only one lingered, playing under a tree and finishing the song. The child's voice rose shrill and clear like that of the blackbird above him. He also sang of life, eternal life, knowing little more than the bird of the meaning of his song, and having little less of that devotion of innocence in which happiness is praise. But Ida had ceased to listen to the singing. Her whole attention was given to the children as they scampered past the hedge, dropping bits of moss and fungi and such like woodland spoil. For, tightly held in the grubby hands of each, plucked with reckless indifference to bud and stalk and fading fast in their hot prisons, were primroses. Ida started to her feet, a sudden idea filling her brain. The birds were right. Spring had come, and there were flowers, flowers for Mrs. Over-the-Way. Ida was a very quiet, obedient little girl as a general rule. Indeed, in her lonely life she had small temptation to pranks or mischief of any kind. She had often been sent to play in the back garden before, and had never thought of straying beyond its limits. But today, a strong new feeling had been awakened by the sight of the primroses. "The hole is very large," said Ida, looking at the gap in the hedge. "If that dead root in the middle were pulled up, it would be wonderfully large." She pulled the root up, and though wonderful is a strong term, the hole was certainly larger. "It is big enough to put one's head through," said Ida, and stooping down she exemplified the truth of her observation. "Where the head goes, the body will follow," they say, and Ida's little body was soon on the other side of the hedge. The adage says nothing about clothes, however, and part of Ida's dress was left behind. It had caught on the stump as she scrambled through, but accidents will happen, and she was in the road, which was something. It is like going into the world to seek one's fortune, she thought. Thus Gerda went to look for little Kay, and so Joringel sought for the enchanted flower. One always comes to a wood. And into the wood she came. Dame Nature had laid down her new green carpets, and everything looked lovely, but, as has been before said, it certainly was damp. The little singer under the tree cared no more for this, however, than the blackbird above him. "Will you tell me, please, where you got your primroses?" asked Ida. The child made a quaint, half-military salute and smiled. "Yonder," he said laconically, and, pointing up the wood, he went on with the song that he could not understand. "Ah, my sweet home Jerusalem, would God I were in thee, would God my woes were at an end, thy joys that I might see." Ida went on and on, looking about her as she ran. Presently the wood sloped downwards and pretty steeply, so that it was somewhat of a scramble. Yet still she kept a sharp lookout, but no primroses did she see, except a few here and there upon the ground, which had been plucked too close to their poor heads to be held in anybody's hands. These showed the way, however, and Ida picked them up in sheer pity and carried them with her. "This is how Hop-o'-my-Thumb found his way home," she thought. At the bottom of the hill ran a little brook, and on the opposite side of the brook was a bank, and on the top of the bank was a hedge, and under the hedge were the primroses. But the brook was between. Ida looked and hesitated. It was too wide to jump across, and here, as elsewhere, there was more water than usual. To turn back, however, was out of the question. Gerda would not have been daunted in her search by coming to a stream, nor would anyone else that ever was read of in fairy tales. It is true that in fairyland there are advantages which cannot always be reckoned upon by commonplace children in this commonplace world. When the straw, the coal, and the bean came to a rivulet in their travels, the straw laid himself across as a bridge for the others, and had not the coal been a degree too hot on that unlucky occasion, they might, for anything Ida knew to the contrary, still have been pursuing their journey in these favorable circumstances. But a traveling companion who expands into a bridge on an emergency is not to be met with every day, and as to poor Ida, she was alone. She stood first on one leg and then on the other. She looked at the water, and then at the primroses, and then at the water again, and at last perceived that in one place there was a large, flat, moss-covered stone in the middle of the stream, which stood well out of the water, and from which, could she but reach it, she might scramble to the opposite bank. But how to reach it? That nice, large, secure, comfortable-looking stone. "I must put some more stones," thought Ida, There were plenty in the stream, and Ida dragged them up and began to make a ford by piling them together. It was chilly work, for a cloud had come over the sun, and Ida was just a little bit frightened by the freshwater shrimps and some queer, many-legged beasts who shot off the stones as she lifted them. At last the ford was complete. Ida stepped daintily over the bridge she had made and jumped triumphantly onto the big stone. Alas, for trusting to appearances. The stone that looked so firm was insecurely balanced below, and at the first shock one side went down with a splash, and Ida went with it. What a triumph for the shrimps! She scrambled to the bank, however, made up a charming bunch of primroses, and turned to go home. Never mind how she got back across the brook. We have all waded streams before now, and very good fun it is in June, but rather chilly work in February. And in spite of running home, Ida trembled as much with cold as with excitement when she stood at last before Mrs. Over-the-Way's green gate. Click! Ida went up the white steps, marking them sadly with her wet feet, and gave a valiant rap. The door was opened, and a tall, rather severe-looking housekeeper asked, "What do you want, my dear?" A shyness amounting to terror had seized upon Ida, and she could hardly find voice to answer. "If you please, I have brought these for whom?" Ida's pale face burnt crimson as she remembered that after all she did not know the little old lady's name. Perhaps the severe housekeeper was touched by the sight of the black frock, torn as it was, for she said kindly, "Don't be frightened, my dear. What do you want?" "These primroses," said Ida, who was almost choking. "They are for Mrs. Over-the-Way to take to church with her. I am very sorry, if you please, but I don't know her name, and I call her Mrs. Over-the-Way because, you know, she lives over the way. At least," Ida added, looking back across the road with a sudden confusion in her ideas, "at least, I mean, you know, we live over the way." And overwhelmed with shame at her own stupidity, Ida stuffed the flowers into the woman's hand and ran home as if a lion were at her heels. "Well, Miss Ida," began Nurse, as Ida opened the nursery door, and there was something terrible in her well. "If I ever—" and Nurse seized Ida by the arm, which was generally premonitory of her favorite method of punishment. A good shaking. But Ida clung close and flung her arms round Nurse's neck. "Don't shake me, Nursey dear," she begged. "My head aches so. I have been very naughty, I know. I've done everything you can think of. I've crept through the hedge and been right through the wood and made a ford and tumbled into the brook and waded back and run all the way home and been round by the town for fear you should see me. And I've done something you could never, never think of if you tried till next Christmas. I've got some flowers for Mrs. Over-the-Way, only I did it so stupidly. She will think me a perfect goose, and perhaps be angry." And the tears came into Ida's eyes. "She'll think you a naughty, troublesome child as you are," said Nurse, who seldom hesitated to assume the responsibility of any statement that appeared to be desirable. "You're mad on that old lady, I think. Just look at that dress." Ida looked, but her tears were falling much too fast for her to have a clear view of anything, and the torn edges of the rent seemed fringed with prismatic colors. To crown all, she was sent to bed. In reality, this was to save the necessity of wearing her best frock till the other was mended, and also to keep her warm in case she should have caught cold. But Nurse spoke of it as a punishment, and Ida wept accordingly. And this was a triumph of that not uncommon line of nursery policy which consists in elaborately misleading the infant mind for good. Chim-chime went the bells next morning, and Mrs. Over-the-Way came down the white steps and through the green gate with a bunch of primroses in her hand. She looked up as usual, but not to the sky. She looked to the windows of the houses over the way, as if she expected someone to be looking for her. There was no face to be seen, however, and in the house directly opposite, one of the upper blinds was drawn down. Ida was ill. How long she was ill, and of what was the matter with her, Ida had no very clear idea. She had visions of toiling through the wood over and over again, looking vainly for something that could never be found, of being suddenly surrounded and cut off by swollen streams, and of crawling, unclean beasts with preternatural feelers who got into her boots. Then these heavy dreams cleared away in part, and the stream seemed to ripple like the sound of church bells, and these chimed out the old tune, quite through the streets with silver sound, and see. And then, at last, she awoke one fine morning to hear the sweet chim-chiming of the church bells, and to see Nurse sitting by her bedside. She lay still for a few moments to make quite sure, and then asked in a voice so faint that it surprised herself, "Has Mrs. Over-the-Way gone to church?" On which, to her great astonishment, Nurse burst into tears. For this was the first reasonable sentence that poor Ida had spoken for several days. To be very ill is not pleasant, but the slow process of getting back strength is often less pleasant still. One afternoon Ida knelt in her old place at the window. She was up, but might not go out, and this was a great grief. The day had been provokingly fine, and even now, though the sun was setting, it seemed inclined to make a fresh start. So bright was the rejuvenated glow with which it shone upon the opposite houses, and threw a mystic glory over Mrs. Over-the-Way's white steps and green railings. Oh, how Ida had wished to go out that afternoon! How long and clear the shadows were! It seemed to Ida that whoever was free to go into the open air could have nothing more to desire. Out of doors looked like paradise to the drooping little maid, and the passers-by seemed to go up and down the sunny street in a golden dream. Ida gazed till the shadows lengthened and crept over the street and up the houses, till the sunlight died upon the railings and then upon the steps, and at last lingered for half an hour in bright patches among the chimney stacks, and then went out altogether and left the world in shade. Twilight came on, and Ida sat by the fire, which rose into importance now that the sunshine was gone, and moreover spring evenings are cold. Ida felt desolate, and on the whole rather ill-used. Nurse had not been upstairs for hours, and though she had promised real tea and toast this evening, there were no signs of either as yet. The poor child felt too weak to play, and reading made her eyes ache. If only there were someone to tell her a story. It grew dark, and then steps came outside the door, and a fumbling with the lock which made Ida nervous. "Do come in, Nursey," she cried. The door opened, and someone spoke, but the voice was not the voice of Nurse. It was a sweet, clear, gentle voice, musical, though no longer young, such a voice as one seldom hears and never forgets, which came out of the darkness, saying, "It is not Nurse, my dear. She is making the tea, and gave me leave to come up alone. I am Mrs. Over-the-Way." And there in the firelight stood the little old lady, as she has been before described, except that instead of her prayer book she carried a large pot hyacinth in her two hands. "I have brought you one of my pets, my dear," said she. "I think we both love flowers." The little old lady had come to tea. This was charming. She took off her bonnet, and her cap more than fulfilled Ida's expectations, although it was nothing smarter than a soft mass of tulle tied with white satin strings. But what a face looked out of it! Mrs. Over-the-Way's features were almost perfect. The beauty of her eyes was rather enhanced by the blue shadows that time had painted round them, and they were those good eyes which remind one of a clear well, at the bottom of which he might see truth. When young, she must have been exquisitely beautiful, Ida thought. She was lovely still. In due time, Nurse brought up tea, and Ida could hardly believe that her fancies were realized at last, indeed more than realized, for no bread and treacle diminished the dignity of the entertainment, and Nurse would as soon have thought of carrying off the Great Mogul on his cushions as of putting Mrs. Over-the-Way and her chair into the corner. But there is a limit even to the space of time for which one can enjoy tea and buttered toast. The tray was carried off, the hyacinth put in its place, and Ida curled herself up in an easy chair on one side of the fire, Mrs. Over-the-Way being opposite. "You see I am over the way still," laughed the little old lady. "Now tell me all about the primroses." So Ida told everything and apologized for her awkward speeches to the housekeeper. "I don't know your name yet," said she. "Call me Mrs. Over-the-Way still, my dear, if you please," said the little old lady. "I like it." So Ida was no wiser on this score. "I was so sorry to hear that you had been made ill on my account," said Mrs. Over-the-Way. "I have been many times to ask after you, and tonight I asked leave to come to tea. I wish I could do something to amuse you, you poor little invalid. I know you must feel dull." Ida's cheeks flushed. "If you would only tell me a story," she said. "I do so like hearing Nurse's stories. At least she has only one, but I like it. It isn't exactly a story either, but it is about what happened in her last place. But I am rather tired of it. There's Master Henry. I like him very much. He was always in mischief. And there's Miss Adelaide, whose hair curled naturally, at least with a damp brush. I like her, but I don't have much of them. For Nurse generally goes off about a quarrel she had with the cook, and I never could tell what they quarreled about. But Nurse said cook was full of malice and deceitfulness, so she left. I'm rather tired of it." "What sort of a story shall I tell you?" asked Mrs. Over-the-Way. "A true one, I think," said Ida. "Something that happened to you yourself, if you please. You must remember a great many things, being so old." And Ida said this in simple good faith, believing it to be a compliment. "It is quite true," said Mrs. Over-the-Way, "that one remembers many things at the end of a long life, and that they are often those things which happened a long while ago, and which are sometimes so slight in themselves that it is wonderful that they should not have been forgotten. I remember, for instance, when I was about your age, an incident that occurred which gave me an intense dislike to a special shade of brown satin. I hated it then, and at the end of more than half a century, I hate it still. The thing in itself was a mere folly. The people concerned in it have been dead for many years, and yet at the present time I should find considerable difficulty in seeing the merits of a person who should dress in satin of that peculiar hue." "What was it?" asked Ida. "It was not amber satin, and it was not snuff-colored satin. It was one of the shades of brown known by the name of feuille morte, or dead-leaf color. It is pretty in itself, and yet I dislike it." "How funny," said Ida, wriggling in the armchair with satisfaction. "Do tell me about it." "But it is not funny in the least, unfortunately," said Mrs. Over-the-Way, laughing. "It isn't really a story either. It is not even like Nurse's experiences. It is only a strong remembrance of my childhood that isn't worth repeating and could hardly amuse you." "Indeed, indeed it would," said Ida. "I like the sound of it. Satin is so different from cook's." Mrs. Over-the-Way laughed. "Still, I wish I could think of something more entertaining," said she. "Please tell me that," said Ida earnestly. "I would rather hear something about you than anything else." There was no resisting this loving argument. Ida felt she had gained her point, and curled herself up into a listening attitude accordingly. The hyacinth stood in solemn sweetness, as if it were listening also, and Mrs. Over-the-Way, putting her little feet upon the fender to warm. A king once died, as kings are apt to do, being as liable to shortness of breath as other mortals, It was high time this king abandoned his earth life, for he had lived in a sadly extravagant manner, and his subjects could spare him without the slightest inconvenience. His father had left him a full treasury, both money and jewels being in abundance. But the foolish king just deceased had squandered every penny in riotous living. He had then taxed his subjects until most of them became paupers, and this money vanished in more riotous living. Next he sold all the grand old furniture in the palace, all the silver and gold plate and bric-a-brac, all the rich carpets and furnishings, and even his own kingly wardrobe, reserving only a soiled and moth-eaten ermine robe to fold over his threadbare raiment. And he spent the money in further riotous living. Don't ask me to explain what riotous living is. I only know from hearsay that it is an excellent way to get rid of money. And so this spendthrift king found it. He now picked all the magnificent jewels from this kingly crown, and from the round ball on the top of his scepter, and sold them and spent the money. Riotous living, of course. But at last he was at the end of his resources. He couldn't sell the crown itself because no one but the king had the right to wear it. Neither could he sell the royal palace because only the king had the right to live there. So, finally, he found himself reduced to a bare palace, containing only a big mahogany bedstead that he slept in, a small stool on which he sat to pull off his shoes, and the moth-eaten ermine robe. In this strait he was reduced to the necessity of borrowing an occasional dime from his chief counselor, with which to buy a ham sandwich. And the chief counselor hadn't many dimes. One who counseled his king so foolishly was likely to ruin his own prospects as well. So the king, having nothing more to live for, died suddenly and left a 10-year-old son to inherit the dismantled kingdom, the moth-eaten robe, and the jewel-stripped crown. No one envied the child, who had scarcely been thought of until he became king himself. Then he was recognized as a personage of some importance, and the politicians and hangers-on, headed by the chief counselor of the kingdom, held a meeting to determine what could be done for him. These folk had helped the old king to live riotously while his money lasted, and now they were poor and too proud to work. So they tried to think of a plan that would bring more money into the little king's treasury, where it would be handy for them to help themselves. After the meeting was over, the chief counselor came to the young king, who was playing peg-top in the courtyard, and said, "Your Majesty, we have thought of a way to restore your kingdom to its former power and magnificence." "All right," replied His Majesty carelessly. "How will you do it?" "By marrying you to a lady of great wealth," replied the counselor. "Marrying me?" cried the king. "Why, I am only 10 years old." "I know, it is to be regretted, but your Majesty will grow older, and the affairs of the kingdom demand that you marry a wife." "Can't I marry a mother instead?" asked the poor little king, who had lost his mother when a baby. "Certainly not," declared the counselor. To marry a mother would be illegal. To marry a wife is right and proper. "Can't you marry her yourself?" inquired His Majesty, aiming his peg-top at the chief counselor's toe and laughing to see how he jumped to escape it. "Let me explain," said the other. "You haven't a penny in the world, but you have a kingdom. There are many rich women who would be glad to give their wealth in exchange for a queen's coronet, even if the king is but a child. So we have decided to advertise that the one who bids the highest shall become the Queen of Quok." "If I must marry at all," said the king after a moment's thought, "I prefer to marry Nyana, the armorer's daughter." "She is too poor," replied the counselor. "Her teeth are pearls, her eyes are amethysts, and her hair is gold," declared the little king. "True, your majesty, but consider that your wife's wealth must be used. How would Nyana look after you have pulled her teeth of pearls, plucked out her amethyst eyes, and shaved her golden head?" The boy shuddered. "Have your own way," he said despairingly. "Only let the lady be as dainty as possible and a good playfellow." "We shall do our best," returned the chief counselor, and went away to advertise throughout the neighboring kingdoms for a wife for the boy king of Quok. There were so many applicants for the privilege of marrying the little king that it was decided to put him up at auction in order that the largest possible sum of money should be brought into the kingdom. So, on the day appointed, the ladies gathered at the palace from all the surrounding kingdoms, from Bilkon, Mulgravia, Junkum, and even as far away as the Republic of Mekvelt. The chief counselor came to the palace early in the morning and had the king's face washed and his hair combed, and then he padded the inside of the crown with old newspapers to make it small enough to fit His Majesty's head. It was a sorry-looking crown, having many big and little holes in it where the jewels had once been, and it had been neglected and knocked around until it was quite battered and tarnished. Yet, as the counselor said, it was the king's crown, and it was quite proper he should wear it on the solemn occasion of his auction. Like all boys, be they kings or paupers, His Majesty had torn and soiled his one suit of clothes so that they were hardly presentable, and there was no money to buy new ones. Therefore the counselor wound the old ermine robe around the king and sat him upon the stool in the middle of the otherwise empty audience chamber. And around him stood all the courtiers and politicians and hangers-on of the kingdom, consisting of such people as were too proud or lazy to work for a living. There was a great number of them, you may be sure, and they made an imposing appearance. Then the doors of the audience chamber were thrown open, and the wealthy ladies who aspired to being Queen of Quok came trooping in. The king looked them over with much anxiety and decided they were each and all old enough to be his grandmother, and ugly enough to scare away the crows from the royal cornfields. After which he lost interest in them. But the rich ladies never looked at the poor little king squatting upon his stool. They gathered at once about the chief counselor who acted as auctioneer. "How much am I offered for the coronet of the Queen of Quock?" asked the counselor in a loud voice. "Where is the coronet?" inquired a fussy old lady who had just buried her 9th husband and was worth several millions. "There isn't any coronet at present," explained the chief counselor, "but whoever bids highest will have the right to wear one, and she can then buy it." "Oh," said the fussy old lady, "I see." Then she added, "I'll bid $14. $14,000, cried a sour-looking woman who was thin and tall and had wrinkles all over her skin. Like a frosted apple, the king thought. The bidding now became fast and furious, and the poverty-stricken courtiers brightened up as the sum began to mount into the millions. "He'll bring us a very pretty fortune after all," whispered one to his comrade, "and then we shall have the pleasure of helping him spend it." The king began to be anxious. All the women who looked at all kind-hearted or pleasant had stopped bidding for lack of money, and the slender old dame with the wrinkles seemed determined to get the coronet at any price, and with it the boy husband. This ancient creature finally became so excited that her wig got crosswise of her head, and her false teeth kept slipping out, which horrified the little king greatly, but she would not give up. At last the chief counselor ended the auction by crying out, "Sold to Marianne Brzezinski de la Porcus for $3,900,624.16. And the sour-looking old woman paid the money in cash and on the spot, which proves this is a fairy story. The king was so disturbed at the thought that he must marry this hideous creature that he began to wail and weep, whereupon the woman boxed his ears soundly. But the counselor reproved her for punishing her future husband in public, saying, "You are not married yet. Wait until tomorrow, after the wedding takes place. Then you can abuse him as much as you wish. But at present we prefer to have people think this is a love match." The poor king slept but little that night, so filled was he with terror of his future wife. Nor could he get the idea out of his head that he preferred to marry the armorer's daughter, who was about his own age. He tossed and tumbled around upon his hard bed until the moonlight came in at the window and lay like a great white sheet upon the bare floor. Finally, in turning over for the 100th time, his hand struck against a secret spring in the headboard of the big mahogany bedstead, and at once, with a sharp click, a panel flew open. The noise caused the king to look up, and seeing the open panel, he stood upon tiptoe and, reaching within, drew out a folded paper. It had several leaves fastened together like a book, and upon the first page was written, "When the king is in trouble, this leaf he must double and set it on fire to obtain his desire." This was not very good poetry, but when the king had spelled it out in the moonlight, he was filled with joy. "There's no doubt about my being in trouble," he exclaimed, "so I'll burn it at once and see what happens." He tore off the leaf and put the rest of the book in its secret hiding place. Then, folding the paper double, he placed it on the top of his stool, lighted a match and set fire to it. It made a horrid smudge for so small a paper, and the king sat on the edge of the bed and watched it eagerly. When the smoke cleared away, he was surprised to see, sitting upon the stool, a round little man who, with folded arms and crossed legs, sat calmly facing the king and smoking a black briarwood pipe. "Well, here I am," said he. "So I see," replied the little king. "But how did you get here?" "Didn't you burn the paper?" demanded the round man by way of answer. "Yes, I did," acknowledged the king. "Then you are in trouble, and I've come to help you out of it. I'm the slave of the royal bedstead." "Oh," said the king, "I didn't know there was one." "Neither did your father, or he would not have been so foolish as to sell everything he had for money. By the way, it's lucky for you he did not sell this bedstead. Now then, what do you want?" "I'm not sure what I want," replied the king, "but I know what I don't want, and that is the old woman who is going to marry me." "That's easy enough," said the slave of the royal bedstead. "All you need do is to return her the money she paid the chief counselor and declare the match off. Don't be afraid. You are the king, and your word is law." "To be sure," said the Majesty, "but I am in great need of money. How am I going to live if the chief counselor returns to Marianne Brzezinski her millions?" "Phoo! That's easy enough," again answered the man, and putting his hand in his pocket, he drew out and tossed to the king an old-fashioned leather purse. "Keep that with you," said he, "and you will always be rich, for you can take out of the purse as many 25-cent silver pieces as you wish, one at a time. No matter how often you take one out, another will instantly appear in its place within the purse." "Thank you," said the king gratefully. "You have rendered me a rare favor, for now I shall have money for all my needs and will not be obliged to marry anyone. Thank you 1,000 times." "Don't mention it," answered the other, puffing his pipe slowly and watching the smoke curl into the moonlight. "Such things are easy to me. Is that all you want?" "All I can think of just now," returned the king. "Then please close that secret panel in the bedstead," said the man. "The other leaves of the book may be of use to you sometime." The boy stood upon the bed as before and, reaching up, closed the opening so that no one else could discover it. Then he turned to face his visitor, but the slave of the royal bedstead had disappeared. "I expected that," said his Majesty. "Yet I am sorry he did not wait to say goodbye." With a lightened heart and a sense of great relief, the boy king placed the leathern purse underneath his pillow, and climbing into bed again, slept soundly until morning. When the sun rose, his Majesty rose also, refreshed and comforted, and the first thing he did was to send for the chief counselor. That mighty personage arrived looking glum and unhappy, but the boy was too full of his own good fortune to notice it. Said he, "I have decided not to marry anyone, for I have just come into a fortune of my own. Therefore I command you return to that old woman the money she has paid you for the right to wear the coronet of the Queen of Quoc, and make public declaration that the wedding will not take place." Hearing this, the counselor began to tremble, for he saw the young king had decided to reign in earnest, and he looked so guilty that his majesty inquired, "Well, what is the matter now?" "Sire," replied the wretch in a shaking voice, "I cannot return the woman her money, for I have lost it." "Lost it!" cried the king in mingled astonishment and anger. "Even so, your majesty. On my way home from the auction last night, I stopped at the drugstore to get some potash lozenges for my throat, which was dry and hoarse with so much loud talking, and your majesty will admit it was through my efforts the woman was induced to pay so great a price. Well, going into the drugstore, I carelessly left the package of money lying on the seat of my carriage, and when I came out again it was gone, nor was the thief anywhere to be seen." "Did you call the police?" asked the king. "Yes, I called, but they were all on the next block, and although they have promised to search for the robber, I have little hope they will ever find him." The king sighed. "What shall we do now?" he asked. "I fear you must marry Mary Ann Brodzinski," answered the chief counselor, "unless indeed you order the executioner to cut her head off." "That would be wrong," declared the king. "The woman must not be harmed, and it is just that we return her money, for I will not marry her under any circumstances." "Is that private fortune you mentioned large enough to repay her?" asked the counselor. "Why, yes," said the king thoughtfully. "But it will take some time to do it, and that shall be your task. Call the woman here." The counselor went in search of Mary Ann, who, when she heard she was not to become a queen, but would receive her money back, flew into a violent passion and boxed the chief counselor's ears so viciously that they stung for nearly an hour. But she followed him into the king's audience chamber, where she demanded her money in a loud voice, claiming as well the interest due upon it overnight. "The counselor has lost your money," said the boy king, "but he shall pay you every penny out of my own private purse. I fear, however, you will be obliged to take it in small change." "That will not matter," she said, scowling upon the counselor as if she longed to reach his ears again. "I don't care how small the change is so long as I get every penny that belongs to me, and the interest." "Where is it?" "Here," answered the king, handing the counselor the leathern purse. "It is all in silver quarters, and they must be taken from the purse one at a time. But there will be plenty to pay your demands, and to spare." So, there being no chairs, the counselor sat down upon the floor in one corner and began counting out silver 25-cent pieces from the purse, one by one. And the old woman sat upon the floor opposite him and took each piece of money from his hand. It was a large sum, 3,900,624 dollars and 16 cents, and it takes 4 times as many 25-cent pieces as it would dollars to make up the amount. The king left them sitting there and went to school, and often thereafter he came to the counselor and interrupted him long enough to get from the purse what money he needed to reign in a proper and dignified manner. This somewhat delayed the counting, but as it was a long job anyway, that did not matter much. The king grew to manhood and married the pretty daughter of the armorer, and they now have 2 lovely children of their own. Once in a while they go into the big audience chamber of the palace and let the little ones watch the aged, hoary-headed counselor count out silver 25-cent pieces to a withered old woman who watched his every movement to see that he does not cheat her. It is a big sum, 3,900,624.16 in 25-cent pieces. But this is how the counselor was punished for being so careless with the woman's money. And this is how Mary Ann Brodzinski de la Porcus was also punished for wishing to marry a 10-year-old king in order that she might wear the coronet of the Queen of Quok. The king of the polar bears lived among the icebergs in the far north country. He was old and monstrous big. He was wise and friendly to all who knew him. His body was thickly covered with long white hair that glistened like silver under the rays of the midnight sun. His claws were strong and sharp, that he might walk safely over the smooth ice or grasp and tear the fishes and seals upon which he fed. The seals were afraid when he drew near, and tried to avoid him, but the gulls, both white and gray, loved him because he left the remnants of his feasts for them to devour. Often his subjects, the polar bears, came to him for advice when ill or in trouble, but they wisely kept away from his hunting grounds, lest they might interfere with his sport and arouse his anger. The wolves, who sometimes came as far north as the icebergs, whispered among themselves that the king of the polar bears was either a magician or under the protection of a powerful fairy, for no earthly thing seemed able to harm him. He never failed to secure plenty of food, and he grew bigger and stronger day by day and year by year. Yet the time came when this monarch of the north met man, and his wisdom failed him. He came out of his cave among the icebergs one day, and saw a boat moving through the strip of water which had been uncovered by the shifting of the summer ice. In the boat were men. The great bear had never seen such creatures before, and therefore advanced toward the boat, sniffing the strange scent with aroused curiosity, and wondering whether he might take them for friends or foes, food or carrion. When the king came near the water's edge, a man stood up in the boat, and with a queer instrument made a loud bang. The polar bear felt a shock. His brain became numb, his thoughts deserted him, his great limbs shook and gave way beneath him, and his body fell heavily upon the hard ice. That was all he remembered for a time. When he awoke, he was smarting with pain on every inch of his huge bulk, for the men had cut away his hide with its glorious white hair and carried it with them to a distant ship. Above him circled thousands of his friends the gulls, wondering if their benefactor were really dead and it was proper to eat him. But when they saw him raise his head and groan and tremble, they knew he still lived. And one of them said to his comrades, "The wolves were right. The king is a great magician, for even men cannot kill him, but he suffers for lack of covering. Let us repay his kindness to us by each giving him as many feathers as we can spare." This idea pleased the gulls. One after another they plucked with their beaks the softest feathers from under their wings, and flying down, dropped them gently upon the body of the king of the polar bears. Then they called to him in a chorus, "Courage, friend! Our feathers are as soft and beautiful as your own shaggy hair. They will guard you from the cold winds and warm you while you sleep. Have courage then, and live." And the king of the polar bears had courage to bear his pain, and lived and was strong again. The feathers grew as they had grown upon the bodies of the birds, and covered him as his own hair had done. Mostly they were pure white in color, but some from the gray gulls gave his majesty a slight mottled appearance. The rest of that summer and all through the 6 months of night, the king left his icy cavern only to fish or catch seals for food. He felt no shame at his feathery covering, but it was still strange to him, and he avoided meeting any of his brother bears. During this period of retirement he thought much of the men who had harmed him, and remembered the way they had made the great bang, and he decided it was best to keep away from such fierce creatures. Thus he added to his store of wisdom. When the moon fell away from the sky and the sun came to make the icebergs glitter with the gorgeous tintings of the rainbow, 2 of the polar bears arrived at the king's cavern to ask his advice about the hunting season. But when they saw his great body covered with feathers instead of hair, they began to laugh, and one said, "Our mighty king has become a bird. Who ever before heard of a feathered polar bear?" Then the king gave way to wrath. He advanced upon them with deep growls and stately tread, and with one blow of his monstrous paw stretched the mocker lifeless at his feet. The other ran away to his fellows and carried the news of the king's strange appearance. The result was a meeting of all the polar bears upon a broad field of ice, where they talked gravely of the remarkable change that had come upon their monarch. "He is in reality no longer a bear," said one, "nor can he justly be called a bird, but he is half bird and half bear, and so unfitted to remain our king." "Then who shall take his place?" asked another. "He who can fight the bird bear and overcome him," answered an aged member of the group. "Only the strongest is fit to rule our race." There was silence for a time, but at length a great bear moved to the front and said, "I will fight him. I, Woof, the strongest of our race." and I will be king of the polar bears." The others nodded assent and dispatched a messenger to the king to say he must fight the great wolf and master him or resign his sovereignty. "For a bear with feathers," added the messenger, "is no bear at all, and the king we obey must resemble the rest of us." "I wear feathers because it pleases me," growled the king. "Am I not a great magician? But I will fight nevertheless, and if Wolf masters me, he shall be king in my stead." Then he visited his friends, the gulls, who were even then feasting upon the dead bear, and told them of the coming battle. "I shall conquer," he said proudly. "Yet my people are in the right, for only a hairy one like themselves can hope to command their obedience." The queen gull said, "I met an eagle yesterday, which had made its escape from a big city of men, and the eagle told me he had seen a monstrous polar bear skin thrown over the back of a carriage that rolled along the street. That skin must have been yours, O king, and if you wish I will send 100 of my gulls to the city to bring it back to you." "Let them go," said the king gruffly, and the 100 gulls were soon flying rapidly southward. For 3 days they flew straight as an arrow, until they came to scattered houses, to villages, and to cities. Then their search began. The gulls were brave and cunning and wise. Upon the 4th day they reached the great metropolis, and hovered over the streets until a carriage rolled along with a great white bear robe thrown over the back seat. Then the birds swooped down, the whole 100 of them, and seizing the skin in their beaks flew quickly away. They were late. The king's great battle was upon the 7th day, and they must fly swiftly to reach the polar regions by that time. Meanwhile, the bird bear was preparing for his fight. He sharpened his claws in the small crevasses of the ice. He caught a seal and tested his big yellow teeth by crunching its bones between them. And the queen gull set her band to pluming the king bear's feathers until they lay smoothly upon his body. But every day they cast anxious glances into the southern sky, watching for the 100 gulls to bring back the king's own skin. The 7th day came, and all the polar bears in that region gathered around the king's cavern. Among them was Wolf, strong and confident of his success. "The bird bear's feathers will fly fast enough when I get my claws upon him," he boasted, and the others laughed and encouraged him. The king was disappointed at not having recovered his skin, but he resolved to fight bravely without it. He advanced from the opening of his cavern with a proud and kingly bearing, and when he faced his enemy, he gave so terrible a growl that Wolf's heart stopped beating for a moment, and he began to realize that a fight with the wise and mighty king of his race was no laughing matter. After exchanging 1 or 2 heavy blows with his foe, Wolf's courage returned, and he determined to dishearten his adversary by bluster. "Come nearer, bird bear," he cried. "Come nearer that I may pluck your plumage." The defiance filled the king with rage. He ruffled his feathers as a bird does, till he appeared to be twice his actual size, and then he strode forward and struck Wolf so powerful a blow that his skull crackled like an eggshell, and he fell prone upon the ground. While the assembled bears stood looking with fear and wonder at their fallen champion, the sky became darkened. An 100 gulls flew down from above and dripped upon the king's body a skin covered with pure white hair that glittered in the sun like silver. And behold, the bears saw before them the well-known form of their wise and respected master, and with one accord they bowed their shaggy heads in homage to the mighty king of the polar bears. This story teaches us that true dignity and courage depend not upon outward appearance, but come rather from within. Also that brag and bluster are poor weapons to carry into battle. And now as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.